by our special guest, Volodymyr Vakhitov, professor and senior economist at the Kyiv School of Economics, and also senior research fellow at the Paris School of Economics. And today Volodymyr will present one of his research papers. Welcome.
Thank you very much. This was the research effort which we have done to present for a special issue of the Journal of Comparative Economics. Unfortunately, this was rejected from the journal, but at least we have done this paper done. So I think it was like that. John Brown and David Brown and John Earl have started working on this topic yet in the end of 90s, beginning of 2000s. I joined the team in about 2003 as the research assistant. I was working on the initial batches of this data. Then I got my PhD done, I got my position at Kyiv School of Economics. Salome was my student, now she's PhD student with John. And so this is kind of big family thing. So and we are trying to see what's going on with privatization. Probably this topic is not entirely new, but at least we have the longest data series possible that you can see. It starts in 1989, yet in the Soviet times, and it finishes pretty much almost yesterday. So we try to see the productivity effect of privatization for the manufacturing firm in Ukraine. So what we know. In previous studies, mostly data came from 90s. And if we look at the Ukrainian data, more or less consistent data started getting available around 2000, 2001. So previously there were some small sporadic batches of some so-called registries, and it was very difficult to find very decent samples. So there were mostly small samples of some large firms. So those previous studies were very much written by the selection biases. It was very difficult to find crude ownership, and I think this was kind of my piece of proudness over here, because I was working on getting this variable over those years. I was working with the state property fund, I was working with several other registries, trying to extract that variable over here. So we would like to see how much state ownership remains. This was what many people were looking for. And were there any changes in the performance of the privatized firms? So we looked at the sample of the privatized firms, at the firms which were initially in the state ownership, and we compared those which were privatized with those which remained still in the state ownership. So our sample is the initially privatized firms. So once we're looking at what might affect the privatization and performances, first would be privatization wave, because there were several waves of privatization. It was possible to see that some privatization was in terms of the voucher privatization, some was in big package ownership transitions and so forth. Also, we looking specifically at the foreign versus domestic ownership, because it seems to be very important. Also, it is important to look at the role of the secondary FDI, when the firm was first privatized by some Ukrainian firm, and then it was further on resold to some foreigners. And also, it is important to see whether we have minority versus majority private share. So is the private share is below 50% or between 50 and 100% or exactly 100%? Again, it appears that it may affect the performance of those firms. So once we look at the research, there were several literature reviews on privatization performance. A lot of them have been done by the beginning of 2000s. This was probably the most recent one. And if you look at the specific Ukrainian privatization effects, the initial studies were looking at pretty small samples. Esther and Rosewell were looking at 150 firms, which were surveyed in 1997. Again, this could be only some sample which was not kind of systematic sample collected by Ukrostat. Andreeva was looking at those 1,200 firms within ERC grant competition. I'm not aware if this article if this working paper became an article actually. Akimova, Shvodauer, they also tried to look at 200 firms only during this period. Again, very limited sample size, very limited time period. And finally, the largest paper, which is probably the one that we are trying to base this research, was done by Brown, Earl, and Telagdy. We are going to refer to this as BET. This was published in Journal of Political Economy in 2006. And this was very similar sample to ours. They were looking at the firms from Russia, Ukraine, Romania, and Hungary, but the sample ended in 2002. And the paper was done in 2006. There were some other related papers. The first was privatization effect. There were some about privatization effect on concentration, privatization effect of the ownership type. This was actually done on ULMS data. If you're aware of the RLMS, the ULMS is very similar sample in construction and in the variables. So basically, papers were looking at effects of employment, of effect of privatization, employment, wages, productivity. Also, there was something about political turnover. There was a paper done about the effects of the Orange Revolution. So there was some studies on Ukraine. Also, Gradnichenko and Grigorenko, both graduates of our program, they were doing some paper on oligarch ownership. And we are trying also to extend this oligarch ownership panel and to get this longer panel right now as well. So this is kind of ongoing project still. So some papers have been already, there were some papers, some scope of work which considered Ukraine. However, we are not aware of any study which was long enough to cover a very long period and which would encompass pretty much all state-owned firms for the period for the t equal to 0. So this is pretty much the first paper where we're trying to encompass the entire, I wouldn't say sample, I would say the universe of all state-owned firms into the analysis. Findings from the previous research, what the literature review is doing, it looks like privatizations seem to have lower impact in the former Soviet Union countries compared to the Central European countries. So once we look at the effect on productivity, once we look at the effect on employment outcomes, at the sustainability of the firms, it seems that in Central European countries the effect of privatization was much better. On the other hand, those literature surveys, they count for some study heterogeneity, so it's just quite difficult to compare the studies because the dependent variables kind of different. Sometimes this is productivity, sometimes it's labor productivity, multi-factor productivity, sometimes this is just employment. The methods of estimation were varying a bit. The data scope obviously were varying, so it was a bit difficult to compare them. And the question is, why do we have those differences? Whether there was privatization method or maybe it was some difference in business environment, this question remains open. So it is very difficult to compare the privatization outcomes between countries. So the within country analysis is probably much stronger. In BET we have found that first the Ukrainian privatization had pretty small impact. It was between 2 and 4% increase in productivity for the privatized firms over the first 5 years after the privatization, more or less. It was found that this effect was larger than Russia. And again, if we look at the Russian data, this was probably because there was a certain selection of what kind of Russian data were available. So the Russian data, I don't know if you know about this data set. It was available on the market over here before the year 2004-2005. I don't actually remember how it was called, but this was mostly large joint stock companies only in the data set. And this was the data set that was became available to Brown and Earl, and this is what they were working with. Also, they found the effect was much smaller than in Hungary and in Romania, where the return to privatization was between about 15-20%. And again, the data came through 2002 only. And actually, by the year 2002, we can only tell that only the first wave of privatization in Ukraine was over. So after 2001, some big privatization of the most lucrative firms have started, and this was kind of interesting to see what was going on in Ukraine since then. Also, there was another work in Lithuania, and again, the effect of privatization was between 9 and 12%. Again, it looks like privatization worked for, probably it was because the sample was small, because those numbers actually seem pretty large. Nonetheless, what we are trying to see, we try to look at the full history of Ukrainian privatization and finally close up this question, because we still have some firms which are not privatized, but I don't think this is going further on in some publications. We look at the period from 1999 with all initial state-owned firms. So right now we are looking at the firms which were initially state-owned at the first year when the firm entered the sample. We're looking, unfortunately, only at the manufacturing firms, due to many reasons. First of them is probably because it's just very difficult to understand how to measure productivity for the service firms or for the transportation firms. Also, manufacturing sample has the largest number of variables. For all other firms, they are not so much rich in the data, not so much rich in the variables, so the manufacturing is probably the easiest thing to do. We were also thinking about adding here the estimates of the total factor productivity in quantities. This is also ongoing work because we have some quantities data, but it requires much more work than we actually expected in the beginning. We also look at the evolution of the ownership structure. And this is also a very important part of this paper, because every year, for every firm, we know whether the firm at the end of the year is private, or whether it's private domestic or private owned, or whether this firm is public. And also we can estimate the private share of each firm. So we pretty much know the ownership structure of every firm in the sample for all years in the sample. And this was the largest amount of work just to understand how to calculate those shares. So then we estimate this relative private state productivity. So our experiment, our thought experiment, if you wish, is basically comparing the privatized firms with non-privatized firms, and we see this gain in the productivity. We try to compare this to our neighbors, mostly Russia and Eastern Europe. We would like to have some variation by time of privatization, so it depends when there was any sequencing, was there any pre-privatization changes in the productivity. We also look at the private type, so what kind of private type we have, domestic or foreign. It looks like we have some differences. Also, we look at the regional differences, and with regional differences, it's also ongoing analysis. Finally, we are looking at the privatization sequencing. There was one paper by Sveiner. I don't remember where it was published. I remember this paper in the version of the working paper. He was working on the privatization sequencing in Czech Republic. And I think it was an important contribution to understand that depending upon which cohort of firms have been privatized may affect the performance of the firms within that cohort. So the most lucrative firms privatized first, the less lucrative privatized last, and there is some difference between those cohorts, and this difference can be taken into account at some point. So what we are doing over here, this is the greatest contribution from our point of view, is Ukraine is actually catching up in terms of privatization compared to our neighbors. So can we tell that how have the privatization policies changed? What is the policy effect over here? What was the effect of the ownership structure change? If there is any? And also there was some evolution of the measured effects, which we are trying to measure up. So this is what we are trying to see also is how much state ownership remains, and basically what would be the policy outcomes, what we are supposed to do with those non-privatized firms. We still have approximately 6, 7, 900 non-privatized state-owned firms, and there is a big issue. What are we going to do with that? Because some people say that we have to get rid of them as soon as possible. Some other people say that, well, this is strategically important firms, we have to keep them. And there is still discussion between in the expert community. What are we supposed to do with that? What kind of privatization can work for them the best, the best of the worst? So some problems with the data is, the data is very long, but it's pretty narrow in terms that we don't have the entire richness of data that we can get from other countries. So for example, indeed we have employment, but we do not have differences between, for example, blue-collar and white-collar employment. Indeed we have capital, but again we have only some general estimation of capital, but we don't know how much of this capital goes into structures, what goes into equipment, what goes into into the stores and so forth. So the sample also changes a little bit. Some firms disappear from the sample, and sometimes we just don't know why. So some firms stop submitting those statements once in a while, then they reappear in the statement, and we don't know what happens in between. Also, once we are talking about identification problem, there could be some selection problems. So what kind of firms have been chosen for privatization is the burning issue, the remaining issue, and this is the major source of the selection bias over here. And we were trying to attack that with the different econometrics techniques. And also, the state control group is kind of shrinking all the time. So it's become smaller with time, slowly. And it means that we do not have the control group, which is kind of stable. So once we compare to something, we cannot claim that we compare to always the same control group. And also we have very long time series, so this state control group shrinking could be the aggravated problem. Also the estimation method have indicate a little bit different estimated results. So what we are trying to estimate, we try to estimate relative productivity changes. We are trying to estimate the difference in productivity between firms which remain state-owned and firms which have become private in any possible way, majority private, minority private, and so forth. So what we are going further on, we look at within industry year comparison. So we estimate those, we run those estimations with for every industry separately, for every 2 digits industry separately. We apply 2 different techniques. Majority, this is the firm fixed effects, and the firm fixed effects with specific firm trend. Later on, I will explain what those firm trends are. The data, once we're looking at previous studies, the data are more or less universal for Hungary, Lithuania, Romania, and Ukraine. For Ukraine, the data is universal starting in 1998. If we're looking at the Russian data were only limited to manufacturing industries. Only large firms were included into the sample of the Russian data, and material costs for some reason were not available. So for the Russian data, it wasn't possible to measure any value added, to find any value added measures. So the Russian data did not have any material cost, any expenses for materials, at least at the moment when we were looking at that data set. Also, for the Russian data set, information on ownership was kind of limited. It was only possible to find whether the firm was 100% private or it was mixed, and we don't know whether it was private, majority state. Also, whether the firm was 100% state, obviously, and whether the firm had some share of the foreign ownership. And again, 1% or 5% of foreign ownership versus 100% of foreign ownership making a completely great deal of difference here, and we don't know much. And also at that data set, the data died actually after 2005. Starting approximately since that time, I think it would be possible to work with Ruslana, but we never worked with Ruslana since then. So actually, I think that we have kind of decided to stop working with the Russian data and we converted to the Ukrainian data. What kind of data sources we have for Ukraine? The first one was so-called industrial and enterprise registries. There was one data set in 1989, and there was several data sets between 1992 and 1998. This was the data set which included all big manufacturing firms, and since majority of the firms were big and majority of the firms were manufacturing, this data set included approximately 94% of the employment which was reported by Держкомстат. Держкомстат is Ukrainian Statistics Office. So this was pretty large data set in terms of manufacturing industries. Another statement which was called enterprise performance, in Russian which was called один предприятие. And this performance statement, it included data on investment, on detailed output, on detailed employment. I mean, it was possible to find full-time, part-time employees. It was possible to find some data on material costs, also a little bit more detail. So this was pretty rich data, but the problem with this one, this statement was universal for the years 1999 through 2007, and after that they shrink the sample by a little bit. So they shrink the sample by a third, and then they shrink the sample by about two-thirds again. So they started with approximately 350,000 firms, and right now we're talking about 50,000 firms for the last 4 years. The balance sheet statement and financial results statements are very much similar. They provide similar information as those which are right now going on in Russia. And these are the universal data sets. They always include all commercial firms which are available on the market, and we are talking between, again, 300,000 firms in 90s and approximately 450,000 firms right now. So we're basically looking about the entire universe of all the firms based on those balance sheets, because every commercial firm has to submit the balance sheet to the Ukrostat, and majority of the firms actually obey this rule. Also, we have the data for the foreign direct investment. The data come from 1999 to 2013, and it was possible to find some foreign ownership from the registers as well. So we could actually reveal whether a firm has any foreign ownership. And for those foreign direct investment data for the years from 1999 until 2008, it was clearly possible to see the variable which said the share of the foreign ownership in that particular firm. And we cleaned that variable, we worked with this variable, so we could easily see what kind of foreign ownership that firm had. Also, another data source is the State Property Fund Registry. This was available from 1991 until recently. We actually ordered this data annually from the State Property Fund. We explained what kind of form we need, and they actually got us the data in the format we need. And this was basically the registry of the firms in the state ownership. This was probably not all the firms in the state ownership, but this was absolute majority of them. Why not all? Because some of the firms were in the ownership of the State Property Fund. They were kind of supervised by the State Property Fund. Other state-owned firms were kind of supervised by some special ministries, by Ministry of Mining, of Coal Mining, the Ministry of Energetics, the Ministry of Transportation. So some of the firms were not in this the State Property Fund, but still we could get a special property code from other forms which was applied with those previous sheets. So we kind of looked at all different forms to try and to understand whether the firm is state-owned or not. So based on those statements, we could get the data on output, which was basically sales, on employment, on capital stock, on the material cost, on the wage cost, on foreign ownership, on domestic ownership. I guess this is pretty much it for every firm, for every year, for all those years in the sample. So we were talking only about manufacturing firms. This was, if you look at the previous edition of NACE or QUET, whatever, this was 22 two-digit sectors, and estimation have been done within each sector separately. It wasn't pooled, it was kind of done separately for each subsector. The firm had to be majority state-owned at the first observation when the firm entered the sample. So once we look at the firm, we know that for the year 1, the firm was majority state-owned. We required that all basic variables were not missing for at least 1 year. So if the firm had missing at least one missing variable in all observations from the key variables, we kind of dropped that. Also, we did not allow more than 2 ownership switches. What does it mean? Sometimes it was possible to see the data that the firm was reported as the state-owned. After some years, it was reported as majority private or fully private. And then after some other years, it was again reported as the state-owned. Why do you think it happened? It was some court decisions, some litigations, it was pre-privatization, but those cases were pretty rare. It wasn't crucial for this firm, so we decided just to swipe them down from the sample because it was very difficult to deal with them, and we decided to look only at the cases where we didn't have no re-privatization. There were some cases which actually went out to media. I think you could remember some cases about Kyiv, which was the case of between Pinchuk and some Indian manufacturer in 2005. And there was big case when this firm was pre-privatized at a much larger amount of money. But well, this was kind of exception. So we decided to get them out. So this is our sample size. We are talking about 7,000 firms. And we are talking about about almost 100,000 observations. So this is kind of our sample. This is what we kind of try to get into. And this kind of the number of firms is increasing because some of the firms are processed manually. So we kind of add those firms to the sample from time to time. Ownership. The state ownership is equal to 1 if the state property fund reports at least 50% state ownership. So if the state has at least 50%, we consider it state ownership. By the law, the state has some exclusive control rights if the state has at least 25% plus 1 stock. However, in practice, it's not always working. So sometimes it doesn't work. So sometimes the more than 25% belongs, 25% of the stock belongs to the state, and still the state doesn't have any control because this is kind of some oligarch ownership, or this could be some grabbing hand or something like that. So we looked at the sure cases when the state could control at least 50% of the stock. In that case, it was clear that the state had some control over that firm all the time. Also, the balance sheet had additional file which had some kind of all different classificators for the firm. It has something like classification for the territory code and classification for manufacturing, classification for the firm type. And also it had, in some years, they had property form code. And if that property form code was state, then we consider that in that year the firm was state. Also, if we were looking at minority and full privatizations, those they were measured only in the state property fund. So we looked exclusively at the state property fund database. We got the database and snapshots of this database for several years, and we looked at the dynamics of privatization. So basically in the database you could literally see how many stocks were sold on some particular day for some particular firm. So you could extract this information, you could kind of build the entire dynamics of the privatization for the firms. The firm is considered foreign if the firm is private, so we assume there are no state-owned foreign firms, and if the non-resident share is greater than the resident share. This was done basically from the FDI data. FDI data is available for almost all years. So we basically could observe evolution of ownership after initial privatization. So once a firm became private, it was possible to see that some stocks of this firm have been sold over to some foreign owners. And also we have to understand that once we are talking about foreign ownership, we also talking not only about foreign, we are talking about foreign offshores, and we are talking about foreign Russian. Due to many historical reasons, foreign Russian is not entirely foreign. The performance of the Russian firms in the Ukrainian market was drastically different from performance of, say, German firms in the Ukrainian market. It was much closer to the Ukrainian firms. Also, once we're looking at the offshore ownership, again, offshore ownership is usually concealed Russian or Ukrainian ownership, and we decided to look at the offshore ownership separately, and thanks to this data, we actually could do this as well. So this is the evolution of the ownership. In the 90s, all firms were 0% of the firms were private. Then there was a period of this very mass privatization between 1993 and the beginning of 2000. And basically by the year 2001, majority of the firms were privatized. And whatever we see over here were privatization of the most lucrative assets. So for example, this was Obolenergo. This was privatization of some commodity firms, some Nikopol, some aluminum alloys, some assets which were very lucrative for special oligarchic groups. So right now we are talking about privatization of big blocks and privatization for some specific purposes. Over here we are talking mostly about voucher privatization, about privatizations in the hands of the workers or in the hands of the managers, and actually it looks like conversion of this ownership from workers to more block owners could affect the productivity as well. So we're looking basically at this period before roughly 1997, and then we look at another period which is between 97 2002 and after 2002. So 2002 and 97 are kind of two cut points in this entire story. Also, we see that the share of the foreign firms is steadily increasing. It has decreased a little bit after the Orange Revolution, again because some of the offshore ownership was converted into Ukrainian, and probably that means that not this offshore ownership was not entirely foreign, but still we see that there was very slight trend to increase in the number of firms in the foreign share. However, if you're looking at the number of firms, the foreign firms would constitute between 3 and 5% in the entire sample. If you're looking at the total assets of the foreign firms, if you're looking at the employment of the firms, if you're looking at the share of the output of the foreign firms, those numbers are going to be much larger. So for employment is something between 15 and 20%. Output is also between 10 and 15%. So the foreign firms, the smaller number of foreign firms control the larger number of the assets and employment in the country. So I think it's also important to understand that the small number of the foreign firms doesn't mean that it is negligible. It is sizable, and we have to admit that as well. So if we look at the private share types, some of the firms were private and they always remained private. Some of the firms were majority private, but then the share of the majority private decreased because they converted from majority private to fully private. So majority private means something like 75% belong to the private entities and 25% belong to the state. So this was kind of the period between 1997 and roughly 2007 when some remaining minority blocks of the state ownership were converted to the private hands. So this was not privatization per se, this was what is called do-privatization. So something that they tried to privatize whatever private blocks which were remained. They tried to sell them off without touching completely 100% private firms. So if we look at the total register of all private objects which were in the possession of the state, for the year 1992, there were roughly something like 45,000 of all different objects. And those objects could be a firm, this could be a room in some building, this could be some kind of piece of equipment, piece of truck, and the state property fund had to get rid of this as soon as possible. So this was the entire dynamics when firms which were kind of minority or majority private converted to the fully private. So this was not like overnight. This was the period which took so much time. And I think this is another virtue of this paper, that we could look at those consequences in the privatization. So productivity. Productivity is measured as the multi-factor productivity within 2-digit industry year sales. So we measure it by each industry, 2-digit industry separately. We estimate it with a very simple Cobb-Douglas. From all my experience in estimating productivity on Ukrainian data, it actually doesn't matter much what kind of method you use. We could use usual OLS, we could use fixed effects, we could use fixed effects with trends, we could use Oley-Peikis, we could use Levin's pattern. Still, the ranking of the productivity between the firms is more or less the same. All those measures produce something like 75–80% of the rank relation, so we have chosen the easiest thing to do. So output would be net sales after the indirect taxes. Indirect taxes would be excise taxes. I'm not sure about VAT. So this is the line in the financial result statements, and we have basically taken this line. Employment is the average number of enlisted employees. This is very rough equivalent of full-time employment. And capital is the average book value of the capital stock, which is deflated by the annual revaluations. So this was pretty tedious procedure. So we got the value of the capital at the beginning of year, the value of the capital at the end of year. We got the difference between them two. We got some kind of annual deflator. So if you're interested, I can show you this separately, or I can ask Shalomir to do this, because this was the one who was doing this. But this was, we tried to get rid of the, we didn't have any capital deflator, so we tried to create our own some kind of quasi-deflator. Output was deflated by sectoral deflators, and what else? We don't have materials over here. So for output, we had sectoral deflators available from Держкомстат. So we basically got those deflators directly. So equation. This is the type of the equation that we are going to estimate, and this is what we have. We have output on the left-hand side. This is our dependent variable. We have some production function, and we have vector of industry year interactions, just to make sure that we have them differently. We have those aggregate time effects. So if this W is equal to 0, that means we don't include time altogether. This is going to be just usual pool to LS. If this W is equal to 1 separately for each firm, this is usual fixed effect. If this W changes from 1 to T, then it is going to be what is called specific time firm trends. So basically we included this component over here, and this was the vector of the ownership variables. This was state-owned, domestically private or foreign private. And this is basically, this theta is our major component that we are looking at. So we are looking how this theta is actually changing. We're trying to estimate the theta, and we're going to report this theta all the time. Also, OLS is kind of benchmark, but we're using fixed effects and fixed effects with the firm trend as our major specification. So this is what we have. If we simply look at the relative productivity of privatized versus state firms. If we estimate this by OLS, we see that this privatization gain is something like 11%. If we estimate this by fixed effects, it's about 10%. If we include those firm trends, we are looking at something like 5%. So basically, we interpret this that the productivity gain from privatization on average for the entire sample is between 5 and 10%, which is pretty much in line with all other studies which were done on Ukrainian, Russian, Hungarian, Romanian data and Lithuanian data as well for that matter. Then, if we're looking at the productivity, at the relative productivity growth, so it looks like we don't always have pre-trend coefficients statistically significant, but if we look at the dummy, which indicates post-privatization performance, so after the privatization, it looks like the performance of the firms have improved. And this estimation is consistent across two specifications at a level of approximately 7%. If we look at the Ukrainian sample, similar to the sample from Hungary, Romania, and others, we can see that Ukraine over here is actually on the right, and depending upon what kind of estimation procedure we use, fixed effect or fixed effect with trends, or what kind of productivity we use, this is labor productivity, this is usually output, it looks like in Ukraine the productivity gains were probably among the lowest. And this comes from the aggregate studies from BET and the recent Lithuanian studies. However, what is important if we're looking at the relative productivity by the period. So we look at the productivity for firms which were privatized before 2002 and after 2002. And this is what we see. We see that firms which were privatized after 2002 seem to have larger effect on productivity. So privatization was more important for firms which were privatized after the year 2002. Again, after the year 2002, this was mostly so-called oligarchic privatization, which was privatization in the name of many industrial manufacturing groups. And this basically could reflect not only gains in the productivity, but also gains in the market structure. So because some of those firms virtually got either they got subsidies from the state, or they got exclusive monopolistic position, which was explained by the closeness to the president or to the president groups for different presidents. If you're looking at this in dynamics, then we see that private state relative productivity has changed from year to year, but actually it oscillated between 0 and 5%. So it looks like every year the productivity gain was pretty modest, but still the productivity gain was visible. And this was, except for the first period, the confidence intervals was reasonably narrow. The question is how we can relate productivity in Ukraine to the Central European levels, and it looks like we have a little bit strange picture. It looks like after the year 2002, the average productivity gains in Ukraine were larger than average productivity gains from privatization in the Central and Eastern Europe, especially in Hungary and Romania. The question is why. Probably this was due to the type of the privatization, because the mass privatization was ended in 1997, 1999, or probably there was a certain sequencing of firms which were prepared for the privatization. So the most lucrative firms were privatized first, for example, in the Central Europe, and they were privatized last in Ukraine. Maybe because of that. Also, we're trying to look at the ownership composition. Was there any difference between foreign and domestic ownership? And we're also trying to look at the privatization depth, whether the full privatization or partial privatization also makes sense, also important over here. And finally, we were looking at the state sector as the control group. So every year we basically compared the privatized firms with the state firms. But since the state firms did not undergo any restructuring, it could be possible that the state firms were kind of deteriorating over those last 20 years, and which is pretty much the truth. If you look at the state at the state of the art of the capital assets of the state-owned firms, you can see that those capital has been much more deteriorated, much more depreciated than with the private firms, especially for the firms which are marked that they are never going to be privatized. So also, it could be possible that there were some improvements in the business climate. And also, if you look at maybe not the ideal, but still some kind of ranking, which is provided by EBRD, we can see that indeed there was some pace of reforms, especially when Ukraine was going to enter the WTO. Some massive reforms have been introduced in the country, and those reforms have improved the business climate. In our other paper with another co-author, we have shown that privatization of the service, that restructuring in the service sector actually improved productivity of manufacturing firms. And that means once we have a better service sector, once we have better banking, better financial service, better insurance, this could have some spills over to the manufacturing sector, which is also not much included over here. So if we look at the firms which were privatized before 1997 and after 1997, then the fixed effect method shows that the effect was kind of modest. Fixed effects with firm trace shows that the effect is actually negative. But if you look at the standard errors, you see that the standard errors show that this is basically, the effect is basically negligible. So we don't see much effect on productivity for the firms privatized after 1997. I think we cannot catch it with our econometric methods. Whereas for the firms privatized before 1997, the effect was significant. One of possible explanations to that, again, once we're talking about stories here, it could be possible that the sample size, the sample difference was kind of huge. Absolute majority of the firms were privatized before 1997. Some firms were privatized after 1997, and the heterogeneity of those firms was much greater. That is why we have such huge discrepancies in the results, such huge standard errors. And also, we were trying to look at the sequences, whether we have the story that first the best firms were privatized first or were privatized last. Again, we do not see much conclusive results over here because after the year 2002, the estimates become quite noisy. The estimates become very dispersed, and this is very difficult to tell for sure that something was going on. Probably we need some other study to look at the firms which were privatized after 1997, after 2002, just to look specifically at those firms, trying to understand is that group of firms is drastically different from anything else. Because right now we kind of look at all firms together in the pool, and apparently those firms privatized over here are probably different. Then, if you look at the efficiency of privatization by domestic versus foreign, this is what we see, and this is what we see in all transition countries, that foreign ownership is much better in terms of the productivity gains compared to the domestic ownership. So the performance of the foreign-owned firms is approximately 3 times larger compared to the domestic owned firms. And this kind of result, it repeats itself in all studies. It repeats itself in the theoretical literature. One of possible explanations is because they have better hands and better management. Another explanation is they're basically cherry picking. Again, sometimes this is difficult to catch the cherry picking. Do you know the cherry picking? This is just getting the best firms first. But still, we see this result, and then we try to decompose this result into different types of the foreign ownership. So this would be estimates from the domestic versus foreign ownership. We can see that, for example, over here, the productivity gain of the privatized firms which are domestic is something like 10%. For the foreign firms, it's something like 40%. If you include the firm trends, the estimates are more modest, like 5% versus 20%, but still the discrepancy is kind of substantial. If we include different type of the ownership, if we include offshore ownership, Russian ownership, and other foreign ownership, we can see that offshore and Russian foreign ownership are slightly better than domestic foreign ownership, twice as better, okay. But if you look in the other foreign, if we look separately at Japanese, German, Italian, Finnish ownership, the productivity gain is going to be much greater. The story is very similar once we use different methods for the analysis. And again, it looks like offshore and foreign ownership, they do not gain too much. They do not lead to very large substantial gains in the privatization. So once we are talking about privatization, from the policy point of view, it's much better to find some foreign investor than the investor from some offshore firm. This is also, we look at the difference by the private share if the privatization is full or majority or minority private. So it looks like only full privatization really has some gains. If the state has some share in the firm, irrespective of the method of the estimation, it looks like this is going to be worse for the firm. So once a state has some share in the firm, from the policy point of view, we need to get rid of this share of the state as soon as possible, because otherwise we do not have any performance gains. Finally, we would like to look at the relative productivity by the region. If you look at this map, you will see that there is no any single pattern. So moreover, if we look at the fixed effects versus fixed effects with time trends, we see that even the regions have different rankings. So we basically see that Kyiv is always in the leaders, and Kyiv over here and Kyiv over here is kind of revealed. So we see that they are always in the first cohort. We see that Odessa for some reason actually changes, but this is actually pretty well developed region. We see that, for example, Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk, and remember these are the data before 2014, they are more or less in the same ranks. But the rest of the countries kind of changes depending upon the method of the estimation. I think one of the reasons for that is because we have to introduce proper weighting of the data. This is just some demeaned, some demeaning by the industries, but probably we have to understand the total weight of the industry in the region, because it might change a little bit, and this method of the firm trends can pick up those differences as well. So the privatization was conducted in some waves. And that basically means that to catch those waves, we probably have to build this map according to those waves. We do not have to make the average over the entire period, especially because the period is very long. So once we look at this private state productivity, it started low. It's basically we're thinking about converging to Central European numbers. The question is why. We doubt that this is due to the better method of privatization or to the better firms. We think that, well, convergence of productivity gains to the Central European benchmarks should be more or less the same. It takes time for the firms to restructure, and this is what is important. What we have learned from this study is that privatization doesn't happen overnight. Moreover, privatization doesn't happen over 1 year. Privatization of the firm can take about a decade. So the firm, before becoming, it might take more than 10 years when the firm becomes fully private owned from being fully state owned. Also, what is important to understand is that we have some FDIs and some secondary cells. And those secondary sales, this could be some reselling of some shares of the firms, and this is probably reselling of the best firms to the foreign owners. And that is why it reveals itself in the analysis. Also, we're thinking about this deteriorating of the state sector. So the base for the comparison is deteriorating. It also a little bit blurs the results. But once we are talking about the business climate improving, yes, we are talking. Yes, we have this in mind. And finally, we do not have very clear regional patterns. We have to look at some particular regions in the future research. This is pretty much it. So what we see from the study is that obviously privatization has productivity gains. Obviously, foreign ownership has larger productivity gains than domestic ownership. Also, we see that foreign ownership, when the firm is owned by offshore, so Russian or by Russia, the productivity gains are slightly lower. They are higher than for domestic firms, but they are lower than for the foreign firms. Also, we see that depending upon the wave of the privatization, the productivity gains could be a little bit different, but for later waves, we do not see very clear pattern. On the other hand, approximately a third of the firms, of the previously state-owned firms, still remains at the state ownership, and it looks like from the policy point of view, if we are looking for the productivity increases, we have to get rid of them as soon as possible despite their strategic meaning. I guess this is the major outcomes of the study, and I'm open to your questions.
Yeah. The very first question would be, how did you measure the productivity?
The productivity is basically the residual from the production function. Okay. So if you look at this, it's over here. So this is the production function. This is some controls for the industry. Whatever is left over here is productivity.
Okay, yes, I just read this.
Yeah.
So I would have another question. So you're considering the panel of the firms, right?
Mm-hmm.
But how do you account for those firms which died because of privatization?
They basically got rid of all, well, they left the sample. Why do we know that they died because of privatization and not because of something else? I mean, how can we know that those firms died because of privatization?
I will give you a very simple example from my home city of Kyiv. Our armature завод died because it was privatized very cheap, and people who privatized it, they wanted to recruit money and they sell it as the price of
on the scrap?
Our loan. Yes.
Yeah.
And they earn their money, but the big enterprise died because of privatization.
I think the question over here is not because of the act of the privatization, but how the privatization was conducted. So basically, what kind of price was paid for this enterprise? I mean, I know that this story is not unique. I was in several places in Ukraine. I heard those stories here and there. And it looks like this is that part of the privatization that happened after 2002. That when some big owners had an access to the privatization and there's prices which were lower than the actual value of the firm, in that case, this was basically grabbing of the entire rent and tossing it out. I think this could be revealed in the sample that those firms still had some profits at certain moments of time, and then those firms disappeared completely from the sample. But I think it's a pretty nice question. I think we have to consider it again. So dying because of privatization is something which is it's very difficult to get in the data the true value of the privatized firm. I mean, once we're looking at the firm and the state ownership, and that firm is obviously not efficient. And then we're thinking about how to get rid of the state and that firm. So probably we have to declare some kind of the auction and send it through the auction or something like that. On the other hand, the firm is privatized or some kind of crooked auction or something like, or some kind of crooked procedure which doesn't reveal the true price. However, we usually do not know from the data, and we do not know from the data in state property fund whether the price which was paid for the firm is fair or not. I cannot actually find any way to find anything about the fair price. Because even if we are talking about the firm which was sold on the auction, it is possible to operate some kind of the crooked auction, and in the crooked auction there are going to be some several sellers where the difference between the starting price and the bidding price is very small. Or this difference is small simply because the firm is not lucrative enough. We don't know. So I don't know how to get this from the data, even though such cases could exist. Moreover, there was privatization of Lysychansk plant, if you ever heard about that. It was privatized by the Russian owners, and it was also cut into scraps. It was actually privatized at the full price, but it was cut into the scraps because it was kind of competitor for some of the Russian firms, and very soon some of this product came over from Russia into Ukraine. It was some period of time that it was done. And again, we know this as a story. We cannot see this in the data. We can look to we can go to Lysychansk. We can see some remnants of those of all those lines, of all those buildings which were cut to scraps. We can talk to people who would say that this was very prosperous plant and that was sold over to the Russian owners and it was sold out. We don't know whether it is true or not. We just basically see the stories. We do not see this in the data. Then you will be next. Yes, please.
I have two questions. The first is whether you try alternative measurements of performance and efficiency.
Like what?
Export?
Not all of them are exporting.
Certainly. And if they start exporting, then according to the trade theory, they're definitely more productive. Because the way you treated the re-estimation of the fixed capital output looks a bit of courageous from my perspective. Certainly you've done a lot of work, but two-digit industry deflator, for example, the food industry where you have vodka and bread and you use the same deflator, which would be a bit of problematic. And the second question also refers more or less to the first one. I think your paper deserves more explanation of why your results are so much different from the previous literature. You quoted sources from 2006, 2005 and earlier, and you insisted that your results are different because your time series is longer, you have more firms, and you just used better methods. But as a matter of fact, quick look at the publications from 2015 shows that people already use longer time series and more or less the same number of firms, and they count opposite results. And just I can note the
Could you mention some?
Cleanage, yes, but it's easy. Just make a search in our library. And this insists that there is nil effect from privatization, and moreover, it is diminishing effect. So just opposite what you have done. And I think this this problem can be solved first by alternative performance indicator and by a more careful explanation why you think your results are different if they are better.
It's interesting. And what do you mean by longer series? Some kind of.
Well, you explained at the very beginning that your results are different because you have longer time period. But as a matter of fact, recent papers also have longer, because Ruslan actually has Ukrainian data, by the way, including.
Ruslana has only joint stock companies, and this is the difference.
Definitely not. But anyway, it's not what I'm asking. My question is whether you tried alternative performance indicators, because productivity is very vulnerable indicator when with the kind of inflation you have all these 14 years of observation. And the second is why still you think that the previous literature comes to absolutely opposite conclusions.
I wouldn't say opposite. I would say I would say that our results seem to be numerically slightly different, but at least they're in the same direction. So there is the major outcome of this study is that there is positive gain from privatization,
which most of authors failed to find.
not all of them. So I think it's kind of open discussion here. I'm seriously interested in what kind of paper you're referring to. I would like to.
The name of the guy is Klinich, and actually your co-author also published recently. He mentioned this paper about vulnerability of productivity gains to political cycles, which I think is very interesting, finding that the regions, this is the consequences of Orange Revolution, the regions which voted for Yushchenko, as a matter of fact, performed much better. Which at least
for a certain period of time, yes.
Then the operation deserves probably some control for this political cycle.
I think we are looking here at some kind of general average trend. So if you look at some sub-periods, probably you are right. If you're looking at the general trend,
I'm not a specialist.
yeah, but I think it's
right or wrong. I'm putting a question.
yeah. I think it's
maybe there are very strong reasons for being different. And the second question, whether you tried alternative performance efficiency indicators.
I think from what I know, looking at the exports as the indicator of efficiency is probably not also, wouldn't solve all the problems as well. I mean, the theory says that the most productive firms export, but the practice says this is not necessarily so. If you look at the firms which had very long ties with, yes, I kind of, I will question Melis' theory in this respect here. Because if you look at the very long ties of some Russian and Ukrainian firms, they try to continue those ties despite their productivity, despite all other, how to say that? I mean, they try to continue their cooperation despite the economic reasons for some reason. Maybe not now, but before that, in the period, if you look at the statistics of exports and imports from Russia to Ukraine, from Ukraine to Russia, you could see that there were very similar ties in terms of industrial output, which was sold from Ukrainian firms to Russia and from the Russian firms to Ukraine. So right now, when we see trade embargo from Russia on some Ukrainian firms, and we see some, we see changes in the structure of the Ukrainian export to other countries, and right now we can tell what those firms actually are worth. But still, there were still some ties between Russian and Ukrainian firms, which were trying to be, they try to maintain those ties no matter what. Again, this is kind of mostly for stories, and this could not be pervasive, but I know about some of those stories. When producers claim that despite the war, we would like to trade with Russia because Russia is our major market.
You argued against the stories.
This is not against, this is different stories. We are talking about some manufacturing equipment, and we are talking about the final product. So once we are talking about Lysychansk soda was kind of cut off. But once we are talking about some plant in Dnipropetrovsk, which is building those big tubings for the metro, for the metropolitans, this is pretty much the only one which was built in Dnipropetrovsk in the Soviet times, and the only market for this tubing plant is Russia and Ukrainian, because this is the only metropolitans which could be built with those tubing. So it's very difficult to change the productive lines. That is why they are kind of bound to cooperate after that. So I think the story here is a little bit more complicated than just Melis' story, who simply claims that more productive firms trade. But I think we have to look at this. I think this is very nice, this is a very nice argument. Thank you.
My next question would be about ownership, because I think it's not really fair to make this division to state private ownership based on the property. Because the very recent story with Ukernafta, where the government, the state owned 50+1 share, in fact was controlled by Igor Kolomoisky, who was the minority stakeholder. And speaking about ownership, we have to figure out the person who makes the decision, or an entity who makes the decision. And because it can bring the bias to the results. And is why you might find it such a huge differences in effective privatization in Ukraine and other countries, and which actually leads us to property-right enforcement.
Out of 7,000 firms, how many do you think have this issue as Ukronafta?
I would say about 50%.
Based on what?
Based on, again, knowledge of my home city enterprise performance. And knowing actually my father being a local politician and knowing the entire...
You can't control for this. You can't control for this, and this guy is...
But with Ukronafta it was very simple, because everybody knew that who can make decision in this
Because this is Ukronafta and this is Kolomoisky, but once we are talking about other firms which are not in the media, I mean, we are trying to control for this through this partial ownership. I think this is the best way. This is the best way we can do, and I think this is what was actually shown over here. That some of those firms which are partially owned by the state are basically milking cows for the oligarchs who control even the minority shares of them. And I think this is kind of also clear. And again, I'm not sure how to include this into this kind of story. I don't know how to make this consistent test of who literally controls the plant or who literally controls the firm. So we can try to look at the, you are bound to work with kind of some official sources, right? So if you look at the official sources, you will not find this kind of story. That means you have to get into some journalist investigation, something like that. And the question is how persuasive your sample is going to be after that. So if you know that some of the firms are controlled and you don't know anything about other firms, aren't we starting working in some kind of black hole? So again, I think this is a very good argument. I don't know how to solve it.
Well, I think the recent changes in legislation opens the beneficiaries of all enterprises. It might help.
No. There are a couple of databases which kind of open the beneficiaries of the enterprises anyway. I was looking at those databases, I could see who were the owners of those enterprises, and still it doesn't help much. Because those beneficiaries that are open right now, I look at them, I see that some of the beneficiaries were in the Cyprus. And the Cyprus says that we're not going to open up the beneficiaries. Okay, maybe not Cyprus, it could be Delaware in the USA. So it could be some British Virgin Islands, and again, those countries say we're not going to open the register, so we are not going to open this, we are going to protect that. And the final owners are going to be somewhere, we don't know where. We can guess that this is a part of this big structure and some kind of money laundering scheme. We can try to get through this. But sometimes if you look at the entire chain of the ownership, sometimes it's very difficult to understand even who has at least one stake in this, not talking anything about the total amount of stakes. Because you see that this company owns 20% of this one, and this company owns 5% of this one, and they all together own something else, and those two own something else. I was looking at the ownership of Stirol, for example, and it was, I finally found some kind of pavilion which was selling some sausages in Donetsk, which was also a part of the property of the entire story of Stirol ownership. And how we are going to treat that one, because some of the guys were somehow connected to Firtash family, I don't know. So it's again, we have to work with some kind of more or less official sources. I don't know how to incorporate this into the story. But this is probably very true, and this probably requires much longer analysis, much deeper analysis into the ownership structures. Again, as I said, this is the variable that we're working on for the last probably 10 years, more or less. And it's still not the best one that we can get.
Thank you for your perfect presentation. I was really impressed by your models and sample size. But can I ask you, do you control this model for the scale, effective scale?
What do you mean?
According to you, you said that foreign firms in Ukraine have much bigger efficiency than domestic firms. Maybe it is just scale effect, because foreign owners refer by large companies?
I think employment numbers to some extent control for the scale effect, because employment is more or less correspondent to the size of the firm. So we control for the size of the firm with the employment numbers. And employment and capital stock altogether. The larger the firm is, the larger the capital stock on the firm. So it could be, well, I think it's possible to run this analysis only for the large firms, for example. If you look at the structure of the data, we have approximately 50,000 large firms and all the rest of the small firms. And the large firms have much richer data, broader statistics. It's possible to run the analysis only for the large firms. But once we're looking at the manufacturing firms, in all industries, but probably food industry, majority of the firms are average or large. So it's...
You use function of production function, which is influenced by capital and labor, and but you didn't include number of laborers directly in this equation.
You mean like additionally just, well, the laborers are here, this is the labor.
Yes, but it's not directly included in, but only as a factor of the resulting production function. And production, for the companies of different scales, situation could be very different. A combination of labor and capital and productivity, and it's not direct indicator of scale.
I think what you're talking about more refers to something like market size. Probably we have to think about, to make some ideas about the market size, because I think this is what actually the scales affects in the first place.
It's not a market size. It's just common definition effect of scale in every industry. Big firms have a large.
Well, I think we can check it. So if you look at the scale of the foreign firms versus domestic firms, if we are going to see any significant difference between those two, because again, the number of the foreign firms is not very large, and the distribution of the size of the foreign firms probably is going to be pretty similar to those in domestic firms, with some deviations obviously, but again, how crucial those deviations might be, I can't tell. So it's still not the perfect data set, It's
okay, thanks. And my second question is about regulation, law regulation in private sector and in public sector, because we know, according to you, the productivity of Russian private companies was -3%, as far as I understood.
It was in one of the estimations. I was a bit surprised to see that actually. So. Yes, this is the one, I guess, right? So I think this was in the previous study of.
What is the date? What is the year of estimation?
This comes from this BET sample. The Russian sample came from 1985 to 2001 or 2002. So basically, this was also the Russian registries. They included for the 90s, the data included only the largest Russian firms. And this was basically performance of the largest Russian firms after privatization, and this probably the effects didn't kick in yet. There was some other reasons. This is kind of comparison to the previous studies. This is not what we did in this paper, so I can hardly comment on the previous.
So, in my opinion, if we measure efficiency of private companies nowadays in Russia, we could find that it was decreased because of law regulation was dramatically changed during this time, because in 1990s it was always were open for private companies, but nowadays they have some barriers to to export some goods and import some goods, and some rules of privatization will change.
Do you suspect any regulations in Ukraine for that matter?
Yes, because I think so. Because
I'm not aware of the sector of regulations. I'm not aware of the regulations specifically for the private or public companies. I'm more aware again about the stories where some companies which belong to some particular group were given privileges in terms of compensating VAT, for example, or in getting the access to the ports, or getting access to the metal scrap, or getting access to the markets. I think this could be much more interesting story. But again, on average, we're trying to look at the average effect. We're not trying to chop the sample into some smaller subsamples of very specific owners, of very specific people. I think it's, just returning to your question, I think it could be a very interesting development of this one. I'm not sure this is the goal of this particular paper, but this could be a very interesting development to see the effect of the political regime on the performance. And our next paper, we're going to look at the oligarch ownership effect. Actually, I think this is what you're talking about. So we have got the structure of oligarch ownership for all firms in Ukraine since 2001 or 2002. So like big tables of them. We are trying to work on this right now, just trying to see which firms belong to which oligarchs, to which kind of groups, and were there any performance differences, consistent performance differences for firms within those groups and between groups belonging to oligarchs and all other firms, probably not connected to oligarchs. Again, this is to some extent a bit naive analysis because we don't probably know the entire story, but still this is what we can get from the data. And this is kind of part of the common knowledge. This is what journalists found out, and this is what I got from many of them who got those stories, which firm belongs to which production group. So I think it's kind of be just, let's wait for a while and then probably I can present the results of that in a couple of years.
Any more questions? Yes, sorry.
The very last thing that kind of came to my mind, could you check actually the nationality of CEO or top management of those enterprises, privatized, more privatized, and then control for that? Because what I would suspect that having foreign management would benefit much more.
Gender is probably gender only. I'm not sure that we have the nationality in the data anywhere.
I mean nationality and citizenship.
Yeah, I understand. I don't think that we have it anywhere, at least from those registers, and I have some snapshot of the state register, I have snapshot from the customs, not customs, the tax administration registers for one of the years. There is no any additional information about the nationality of the CEO. So there are some data sets where there is the name of the chief financial officer and the chief executive officers, but this is pretty much it. There is nothing, there is no any other information. I think Alexander Talavera was trying to look at the ownership structure some time ago. He was, I think, back in his student times, that means more than 10 years ago. So but this is pretty much the closest one I can relate. And obviously Gorodnichenko and his co-author was also doing that, but also it wasn't full study because it's just very difficult, if not impossible, to find this kind of data. But again, if you look at the total number of the foreign managers in the total cohort of Ukrainian firms, it's going to be just a matter of less than 1, 2, 3%. Majority of the directors are Ukrainians, right? And only the best firms can hire expats, and some firms can hire people with either dual citizenship, of people with Russian citizenship, or this could be some kind of people who have dual American Ukrainian citizenship. It's very difficult to get.
Any more questions? No, then thank you very much.
Thank you.